everyone, my name is Chetan Hebbale. I'm a consultant here in our government public service practice. Like Jack said, I've been serving clients at the Centers for Disease Control for the past couple years, so happy to see my coalition of CDC folks make it out to the event. Here, me too. So the title of my talk is How America's Money Makes the World Go Around. And this is intended to be a deep dive on the different forces in the global economy and how they work on each other and why they do. And this is a topic I've been interested in really since the 2008 collapse, which happened when I was in high school, and I didn't really understand why everything was happening. And so I kind of had this innate curiosity to put it all together. How does it all work? So if there's anything that you come away with from this talk, it's an understanding of how America came to dominate the global economy. You may have seen some recent headlines, maybe around the trade war with China. So currently the United States has imposed hundreds of billions of dollars of tariffs on China to make it harder for them to export goods into our country. Or maybe you've seen some news around the debate with NAFTA, the big global trade agreement with the US, Canada, and Mexico. And this was just painfully renegotiated and culminated just a few weeks ago. But outside of global trade agreements, maybe you've heard about economic sanctions. This is where the United States is financially punishing other countries for doing things that we don't agree with. And that's happening in places like Iran, North Korea, and Venezuela. So how are all these disparate events connected? There's one common underlying economic principle that ties all of this together, and that's the US dollar. So many people don't know this, but the world economy actually runs on US dollars. So if you are a country that needs to buy and sell goods or services, or you need to borrow money, which by the way, every single country in the world needs to do those two things, then you have to use our money. The latest evidence of this is a poll from the International Monetary Fund back in 2017, which showed that over 60% of global transactions are happening in US dollars, which means if you're Canada, or you're China, or you're Iran, you're ultimately having to use US currency in order to trade with other countries. So let's take a step back. How did we get here? How is it that other countries are forced to use our money? To answer this question, we need to go back to the end of World War II, the last time the global order was pretty much reorganized. Traditionally, the economic power centers of the world have been in Europe and Japan. And the end of World War II, those parts of the world were economically devastated. Not only because millions of people had died, but their industrial and manufacturing capacity was destroyed, their agricultural societies were destroyed, and they had taken on massive war debts to finance the war. But emerging out of all of this destruction was the United States as the world's most powerful economy. Not only because, again, the war didn't happen on our homeland, but we were able to sufficiently mobilize our domestic manufacturing base in order to supply goods and services to the rest of the world. So as World War II is coming to an end and countries are starting to realize that the Allied powers are going to win, 44 countries come to Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, where they all come together and say, what are we going to do with the global economy once the war is over? Pretty much everything is in ruins. So at Bretton Woods, the nations of the world come to three key agreements which have come to shape the global economy today. The first agreement they made is that the United States and the US dollar would serve as the world's reserve currency. What this means is that the US dollar would serve as the common currency between other countries to trade. So if Japan wanted to sell a car to Mexico, they wouldn't sell it in yen and Mexico wouldn't buy it in pesos. They would both transact using US dollars. So all countries of the world would hold a stockpile of US dollars in their banks so that they could trade with each other. The second agreement they made is that all countries would fix their local currency. They would fix the exchange rate of that currency to the US dollar. So how much a Swiss franc was worth, how much a yen was worth, was all dependent on what a US dollar was worth. That begged the question of, what is a US dollar worth? That's where the countries of the world decided that the value of the dollar would be pegged to gold, where they came up with a fixed price of $35 would equal 1 troy ounce of gold. So this was the framework for the global economy at the end of World War II. And the system worked for a couple reasons. One of which is that the US at the time had over half of the world's gold supply, and it was stored at places like Fort Knox up in Tennessee, as well as the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. And the US, having that much gold, basically allowed the US to give a guarantee to the rest of the world that every dollar that it printed could be backed by its weight in gold. The second reason the system worked is that there were large global financial institutions that were created out of Bretton Woods. You probably have heard of the International Monetary Fund, or you've heard of the World Bank. These were created and they're headquartered to this day still in Washington, D.C., and their role is to provide credits and loans to emerging market economies that might be struggling. All of these credits and loans happen in US dollars, which further reinforces the importance of the dollar as the world's central currency. So this system lasted for about 25 years. It ended in the summer of 1971 when Richard Nixon unilaterally ended the convertibility of dollars to gold. And this happened because other countries started to believe that the US was actually spending more money than it had redeemable in gold. So after World War II, the US embarked on massive expansive social programs like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and we also got involved in some very expensive foreign conflicts like Vietnam. So the rest of the world is seeing that the US is printing and printing and printing millions of dollars, and they start to wonder, does the US actually have enough gold to back up all the money it's printing? This sets off a run of speculation, and people start withdrawing gold from the United States. This comes to a head in the summer of 1971 when France attempts to withdraw its gold from the US, and Nixon steps in and blocks the transaction. He gathered with his economic advisors, and they ultimately come to the decision that they would cut off the link between the dollar and gold. This officially ended the Bretton Woods Agreement and the global monetary system at the end of World War II. That set off the worst economic collapse since the Great Depression. The US economy, the entire world economy, was kind of floating helplessly. It no longer had gold as an anchor, and it didn't know what the dollar was worth anymore. For those of you, any of you grew up in the 70s, this was a time of stagflation, this was a time of high unemployment, it was a time of very high economic turmoil. So in order to rescue the dollar, the US needed to find an alternative asset to gold. It needed to find something else it could anchor its currency to. This led to a historic agreement with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. In 1974, Saudi Arabia and the United States came to an agreement known as the Joint Economic Commission. And this had 3 key agreements which has shaped today's monetary system. The first agreement they came to is that OPEC, which is the cartel of the largest oil-producing countries in the world, they agreed that they would only sell oil on the world market denominated in US dollars. And this came to be known as petrodollars. So as Dr. Gilcase here says, this effectually, the petrodollar, became a replacement for the gold dollar standard. And it guaranteed a demand for dollars because countries who wanted to purchase oil had to hold our money to buy it. The second agreement they came to is that any profits that oil exporting countries generated from selling oil would be reinvested back in the United States by purchasing US Treasury bonds, or otherwise known as US debt. This came to be known as petrodollar recycling. And as David White here says, the US government began relying on oil-rich countries in order to finance its trade balance, its deficit spending, or ability to regularly spend more money than we receive in tax revenue, as well as maintaining the value of the US currency. So what does Saudi Arabia get out of this whole thing? The third part of the agreement is that the US would ensure the security of the Saudi monarchy by providing military and economic assistance heretofore. This graph from 2017 shows that Saudi Arabia to this day is the largest beneficiary of the US arms exports industry. And that is a testament to the security agreement we have made with them to keep them safe. So given the backdrop of this agreement, it shouldn't come as a surprise as to the very close relationship the United States has maintained with Saudi Arabia for the last several decades. Across Republican and Democratic administrations, the United States and Saudi Arabia have had one of the most resilient relationships of any two countries in modern history. And this is despite the fact that Saudi Arabia operates very differently from the United States. It's not a democracy. It is a very conservative religious society that, treats human rights differently the way we do. But the economic and political implications of our relationship have endured that, alliance between the two of us. I think there's nothing more telling than this relationship than Donald Trump's first international visit overseas as president was to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Despite the rhetoric on the campaign trail that would make it seem like he wouldn't go there, it was actually his very first visit overseas. So, born out of this agreement, 3 large economic sectors came to dominate the world economy and have come to represent the highest of our Fortune 500. The first is oil and gas. Companies like Chevron, Shell, and ExxonMobil, who do a lot of our drilling and exploring and refining, were ultimately put in place to find the oil in places like the Middle East. And now this has expanded to South America, to the Arctic, to places around the world. These companies continue to this day drill, refine, and explore, and produce the power for turning these lights on, being able to power our cars, the plastics that we use every single day. The defense industry, which would export the arms, like Northrop Grumman, Boeing, and Raytheon, play a huge part in our defense supply chain, our manufacturing industry, and our R&D investments. And they continue to provide the airplanes and the radars and the engines that not only we use here, but are exported around the world. And lastly, financial services companies really became the lifeblood of the global economy. Companies like JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, and Citigroup were ultimately the ones that countries who held US dollars, those are the companies they went to say, how do we spend this money? What is our investment strategy? How can we get banking, securities, credits, and loans? These are the companies that ultimately became the largest global financial institutions, in part because everyone was using our money. Because of the importance of these three sectors in the global economy, it's not so coincidental that they have also become the most strategic corporate sectors in government. So many of the C-suite executives from these companies have gone on to serve at the highest levels of public service in our government. We are probably most familiar as of late with Rex Tillerson, who left his position as the CEO of ExxonMobil to become Donald Trump's first Secretary of State. In the defense space, our number 2 at the Defense Department, Patrick Shanahan, left his role as the CEO of Boeing to become the Deputy Defense Secretary. And in financial services, Stephen Mnuchin also came from Goldman Sachs, who previously was at the CIO of Goldman Sachs, and later is now our Secretary of the Treasury. Goldman Sachs in particular, 3 of the last 4 presidential administrations have had a C-suite executive from Goldman Sachs ultimately become the Secretary of the Treasury. So it seems like all the players are in place to maintain the dollar and America's role in the global economy. But surprisingly, the dollar today is actually facing an unprecedented challenge, in large part because of self-inflicted wounds. The current administration's strategy, which Marco Kalanick, a JP Morgan strategist, notes, is defined by unilateralism, trade wars, and sanctions. It's actually incentivizing other countries to move away from our financial system. One example of this is the renewed sanctions on Iran. So in May, Donald Trump removed the United States from the Iranian nuclear deal and has reimposed sanctions on Iran. What the sanctions on Iran ultimately attempt to do is prevent Iran from using petrodollars. They can no longer export their oil and receive US dollars in return for it. So it's trying to make it harder for them to export oil. The other countries around the world no longer want to agree with US sanctions. And they've actually teamed up together. Europe, Russia, countries in Europe, as well as China and Russia, are developing what they're calling a special purpose vehicle in order to transact with Iran without using US dollars. Marco Kalanick goes on to say that Trump's foreign policy is a catalyst for what he calls long-term de-dollarization. And we're seeing evidence of this trend already, where the dollar share of foreign exchange reserves have started to decline over the last 4 years. So other countries are now beginning to move away from US currency as they see it as not serving in their best interest. What's interesting about the countries that are trying to escape United States sanctions or don't agree with American economic policy is that they're actually going back to the previous system of the way the economy worked. And they are bringing gold back into the international economic system. One example of this is China. In March of this year, they launched what they called a petro-yuan. And it is meant to be exactly a replacement for the petrodollar. It is an oil futures contract that is denominated in yuan instead of the dollar, and it is actually entirely convertible to gold. Dr. Ira Kalish, who's Deloitte's chief economist, he sent out a daily economic briefing. And as part of this briefing, I emailed him and asked him if I could use this quote, and he said it was fine. He says that China's central bank, it's clear now that China's central bank is targeting the value of its currency against gold. And it is doing so intentionally to provide investors with a sense of stability and confidence about their currency to trade. And this harkens back to the world after World War II, where the United States similarly used gold as a measure of stability and confidence for the US dollar. Another example where this is happening is Iran. So Iran has been facing financial sanctions from the US for a number of years. During the Obama administration, we imposed especially strenuous economic sanctions on Iran, the climax of which was when we cut them out of an international payment system called SWIFT, and it's housed in Belgium. So all Iranian banks were disconnected from SWIFT, which basically connected them with the rest of the world economy. To compensate with this, they actually reverted to gold as a bartering mechanism with other countries. So how this worked is that countries like Turkey and India that were big importers of Iranian oil would actually buy gold or sell gold to Iran. And in exchange, Iran would give them oil and gas. Iran would then take that gold and they would trade it with countries like Russia and China, who would then give them manufactured goods or food. And so using gold, they were able to subvert US sanctions for a number of years, and although the sanctions still hurt them, they were able to they were able to stabilize their economy in some form or fashion and not be continually cut out of the US economy. It wasn't until about late 2013 when the Treasury Department cracked down on the sale of gold or the transactions of gold with Iran, which was a tacit, acceptance by the U.S. Treasury Department that gold was as good as money at that point. Cryptocurrencies have kind of added a new wrinkle into this story. They kind of picked up pace, started in 2013 with Bitcoin, and have really taken off in the last year or two. But the countries that are actually adopting it the most are the ones that are facing financial sanctions. Countries like North Korea. North Korea has amassed a massive stockpile of Bitcoin to conduct trade and transmit goods and services. Venezuela this year did the most radical cryptocurrency experiment to date, where they launched their own indigenous national cryptocurrency. So it's a state-backed cryptocurrency called El Petro, and is tied to the nation's oil production. And they've now actually begun paying their government employees in El Petro. Iran is now kind of new to the cryptocurrency space. Now that they're facing financial sanctions again, their Bitcoin market has skyrocketed, and they're also exploring options for indigenous cryptocurrencies. Given all of this, it's just a lot of chaos, a lot of moving pieces here. Jennifer Harris and Robert Blackwell, who wrote this book called War by Other Means. It talks about the concept of geoeconomics, the use of economic instruments to promote and defend national interests to produce beneficial economic results. And this is supposed to be a framework for strategic corporate sectors and for the public and for public officials to find ways to maintain the U.S.'s status in the world economy. So they identified these 7 geoeconomic instruments as ways that the United States can continue to project power and maintain the U.S. economy's role in the global economy. So I want to talk about 3 specifically, as they kind of tie back to those 3 strategic corporate sectors that I was talking about. So oil and gas, defense, and financial services have had their own share of disruption and turbulence over the past couple of years. And they're at a stage where they do really need to be creative and decisive about the way they use geoeconomic instruments to stay competitive in the 21st century. So let's say we look at something like energy policy. The shale revolution has completely changed the energy game. I'm sure you all have heard about fracking, or some form of that. Because of the fracking revolution, the United States is on pace to become the world's largest exporter of crude oil by 2019, which is next year, and possibly latest by 2020. This has completely changed the game. Historically, we have been relying on the Middle East for oil. They have been the largest producers of oil. Now that the U.S. is on pace to become that, we are in a position to become a net energy exporter, so that other countries may still have to hold onto our currency to purchase oil. That's an opportunity that oil and gas is very clearly pursuing, and they're ramping up capacity to become the world's largest exporters. Let's look at cyber policy. For defense companies, historically, they have produced aircrafts, rockets, missiles, engines, things that are very much used by land-based armies. That is no longer really the future of warfare. We are seeing such a massive move into cyberspace where all of our military systems, our economic systems, our personal lives are all interconnected with the internet. And if there's anything we've learned from the 2016 election, it's that other countries have and are developing even more sophisticated cyber technology than we have the ability to protect ourselves from. Dan Coates, who's the current director of national intelligence, said this year that the lights are blinking red on the topic of what they are calling a cyber Pearl Harbor, a massive digital attack that could cripple our country's digital infrastructure. So for defense companies now, I think digital leadership will become the most important facet of state power, and they may have to reorganize their business models around the digital space much more than things like traditional aircrafts or missiles. Financial services companies, when it comes to their investment policy, there is still some confidence that needs to be instilled after the 2008 collapse. The 2008 collapse was really the impetus for the rest of the world to look around and say, can we rely on the United States to maintain the stability of the economic system? When one country went down, the entire world went down. And as a result, they've been looking for ways to diversify away from the United States. This means that financial companies, and especially public officials, need to continue maintaining and continue regulating leverage and risk in the system and making sure that there's no systemic risk if the United States faces further economic turmoil. So I know all this seems kind of very theoretical and high level and abstract and kind of away from our day-to-day lives. So I want to provide a couple examples of what would happen to us if the dollar loses its status that it has in the world right now. The first thing that you would notice is that you'd have a higher cost of imports. A weaker dollar means you can purchase less goods internationally. So your Amazon Prime that you hit for 2-day shipping might cost 2 to 3 times more than it would before, which is something that, of course, would hit our pockets quite closely. The second is that there would be a higher cost of borrowing. So quick show of hands, does anybody have student loans? Does anybody have car loan? Yeah? Anybody, any house loans? There we go. So all of those, of course, you are paying interest. You've taken out a loan on that mortgage. A decline in the value of the dollar would force the Federal Reserve to increase interest rates. And that's because they want to incentivize people to buy U.S. bonds. If they offer a high rate of interest, people will buy U.S. Treasury bonds. In turn, that affects consumers who have taken out loans for everyday things. The last scenario that could happen is that, and that's tied to an increase in the interest rate, is that the government would default on its debt, which is currently sitting at $19 trillion. A default on the debt would, be cataclysmic for the world economy, but it would also necessitate a sharp decrease in government spending. And I know the GPS folks, not only in this room but around Deloitte, our work really is tied to what the government is spending money on. And so if that equation changes radically, then our business model will also have to change. So I just want to close out with this quote from Robert Blackwill and Jennifer Harris that say, economic instruments can produce outcomes every bit as powerful as traditional showings of state power. So instead of thinking of global conflict in terms of my army is better than yours, I have more nuclear weapons, I have more missiles, that is not going to be how the wars of the future are determined. It's going to be how powerful is your economy and how much will your economy dictate the outcomes of what other countries are doing. So I hope you all enjoyed the presentation. Hope you guys learned something from it in the end, but happy to answer any questions. Awesome.
I have a question. You talk about us moving away, or the world moving away from the U.S. dollar as a standard, and the kind of radical impact that's going to have. What's the timeline on this?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So actually, after 2008, the nations of the world actually met, and they said, we want to unlink our reliance on the U.S. dollar by 2018. Actually, they forecasted, they said, 10 years from now, we no longer want to be relying on the dollar. At this stage, as the IMF data shows, still 60% of our transactions are happening in US dollars. So they haven't been able to move away from it as quickly as they wanted. The impetus for something that would happen is another economic collapse. This past month, I think the middle of September, marked the 10-year anniversary of the collapse of Lehman Brothers. And every 10 years, really, we have seen an economic correction. The IMF met this year in April and forecasted by at least 2020, we'll see another economic recession. The amount that China has strengthened its position in the global economy might seriously change the equation at that point, depending on how serious the collapse is. So to be determined, but I think the next time you see an economic downturn, which is mathematically guaranteed to happen, there might be a much stronger move away from the dollar.
So I have a couple questions. One is do the Chinese actually have enough gold to be selling this petro-yuan situation?
Yeah.
And the second is, say that the world does switch completely away from the US dollar to using the petro-yuan that is now backed by gold or whatever they want to back it by. Is there a situation where the US would still be able to hold their position as a world power? Because there are countries like Russia and Germany that are considered world powers, but their currency isn't used.
Totally. So to answer the first question, China is incredibly secretive about the actual amount of gold that they hold. For years, actually, we've been trying to figure out what is the total amount of their gold deposit. Hang on there. The belief as to whether or not they have enough gold is ultimately not a question we can answer right now because they refuse to fully disclose the amount of gold they have within their vaults. In the same way, we know that China technically has $1 trillion of U.S. Treasury debt. That number is actually probably much lower than what it really has. They've been using intermediaries mostly in Belgium. Belgium's now become the third largest, maybe the third or fourth largest holder of U.S. Treasury debt. for a country that's like one-tenth of our economy. And they actually believe that China is siphoning money through that. So we don't know how much gold they have. It's truly a belief that other countries have that China would be able to step in and back up the amount of currency they have in gold. But at this point, we actually don't know. The answer to your second question is, yeah, it's complete. The US dollar is not going to go away. It's not like if the US dollar declines, it just disappears overnight. We have to readjust to a multipolar world where our currency is not the strongest. And what that means is, at the end, we're going to have a higher cost of imports. We're going to have a higher cost of borrowing. As the US economy recalibrates, as the dollar goes down and other currencies go up, that affects our pocketbooks in this way. So it's not like it's going to go away. We're just going to have a painful transition phase where we're going to be hurt a little economically. Some people a lot more than others.
Do I need to transition the composition of my 401k from stocks to bonds in anticipation?
So I would encourage you to invest in Series 1 bonds, or another thing they call TIPS, which are Treasury inflation protected assets. Of course, I'm not sure. Timing the market is impossible. Timing the market really is impossible.
Just thought I would ask.
No, it's a good question. As I started reading more about this issue, and it's like there's this looming collapse. There's looming recession. We know it's coming, and I feel some sense of helplessness. I know it's coming, but what should I do? So one thing I did is I actually did invest in gold. I started putting a portion of my portfolio away in gold because the rest of the world has shown their cards. They have said that how they're going to deal with a dollarless world is by reverting to gold. So there's been a lot written about how the value of gold might go up in the event of a depreciation of the dollar. There are other, of course, they say have a diversified portfolio across different asset classes. There's a bunch of financial jargon that I could get into. I could send you some resources, but
we're going to meet later about this.
Oh yeah.
I do have a real question.
Yeah.
So I didn't know that part about the U.S.-Saudi agreement in 1974. In the last week, there have been a lot of tensions with Saudi Arabia, particularly related to the Washington Post journalists.
Yeah.
And I heard yesterday on NPR that this could be the breaking point for the U.S. Congress in terms of their relationship with Saudi Arabia. So
yeah, well, they always say that actually. So the lowest point was actually in 2016 when the Obama's parting act in office. The only bill that was ever an overridden veto is when he declassified the last 28 pages of the 9/11 Commission, which actually showed links between Saudi Arabian officials and the hijackers, including tens of thousands of dollars that were wired to hijackers in Los Angeles. And the Saudis had threatened that if we declassified those pages, they would sell $750 billion in treasury debt. And they never did it. We declassified it, they never did it. The murder of the Saudi Arabian journalist, it's not going to do anything. I mean, as much as we get worked up about it and we cry out and say this is messed up. Trump even said on the camera yesterday, Saudi Arabia has $110 billion of arms exports. Those underlying forces are what's going to retain the resiliency of that relationship for the long term, unfortunately, because members of both political parties, regardless of who has been in power, has made a vested interest in maintaining that relationship, in large part because it is on their goodwill that other countries are forced to hold our money in order to purchase oil. And no matter what they do, I mean, whether it was a murder of the Saudi journalist, whether it's the murdering of LGBT communities, of women's rights activists, it's the laundry list is high of human rights abuses that we could have cut off a relationship with. The fact that it hasn't happened yet makes me think it's not going to happen in the future. Thanks for bringing that up. That has been in the news over the last few days.
So you kind of hinted at gold and at the yuan as a possible substitute. What's the chance that we go a totally different direction and go to a cryptocurrency or some sort of unthought of?
So I took this slide out actually because I thought it would be a little too dense, but there is a geopolitically neutral reserve currency that's known as special drawing rights. And the International Monetary Fund maintains a percentage of its portfolio in special drawing rights. At Bretton Woods, actually, when the world, again, came together to decide the system, they originally wanted to have special drawing rights be the common currency for the world. At the time, it was called Bancor, but now they've called it special drawing rights. The United States basically strong-armed the rest of the world into having it be the US dollar. So at the World Economic Forum this year, two professors from Hong Kong University gave a presentation on what they call ESDRs, an electronic special drawing rights, which should become a geopolitically neutral currency which can better manage trade conflicts and the ongoing, turmoil in the economic system. If we've learned anything from the trade conflict is that the United States can't be trusted to leverage its role as the US dollar to maintain a prosperous world economy. We start putting tariffs on people. We start putting sanctions on people. So countries around the world want something to insulate themselves from that, and they might turn to special drawing rights, but that's more of like a long-term economic play. It probably will be prompted by the next economic collapse, a ramp up in special drawing rights, but one day that might happen.
So, 3 questions. When we moved away from the gold standard, what happened to all the gold?
It's still sitting there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Could we move back to the gold standard?
Yeah, the reason why we could move back to the gold standard, it just depends on the price of the gold. That's if we set it at the right price, there is, and people have said that if you actually set it with the current amount of money that's been printed, it would probably be around $10,000 for like an ounce of gold, compared to $35. That's also because we have a $19 trillion debt. Like, we have numbers that don't mean anything. We've completely de-linked the value of our currency from what the numbers mean. The end of Bretton Woods is what they've called the beginning of fiat currency, which is money that exists by government decree. The government has said the money has value, but there's nothing actually that gives it value. It's just a promise that the government says that's, it's worth something. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, last question. How would 2008 have been different if we were still on the gold standard?
The main way that 2008 would have been different is that the Federal Reserve would not have been able to print $4.5 trillion out of thin air to purchase toxic mortgage securities. So over the last 10 years, so the way we rescued the economy from the economic collapse is that central banks pretty much stepped in and just straight up bought toxic assets. And they bought US Treasury bonds. And that has slowly inflated asset prices of the stock market over the last 10 years. The US Federal Reserve couldn't do that. It couldn't print that much money if it had to be tied to the gold standard, where it needed to have enough gold equivalent to the amount of money that it printed. So that's the main reason we moved away from the gold standard, is that we really wanted to print more money than we had redeemable in gold, and that we enjoyed the power of doing that. That's the reason why our government spending has exponentially increased every year since the 70s, and is now, again, at unconscionable levels. The numbers don't even really mean anything anymore. We enjoy that benefit. We want to be able to print as much money as we want. We benefit from other countries having to use our money. That allows us to continue printing as much money as we want. The gold standard would force us to be more fiscally conservative, which neither political party wants to do. Cool. Awesome. Anything else?